And you know what my first thought is when I'm thinking about how I interact with another culture is where do they stand on formality and on hierarchy? And the answer might surprise you. So I always thought the US was kind of a relaxed kind of, surfing kind of place. And people call each other sir and ma'am. Yes. And I much more often see people use like Mr. So-and-so, Mrs. So-and-so. In the UK, you just use first names. So that's just a good example of where I'm going to look rude if I hadn't picked up on that kind of social hierarchy side of how you address people, where your place in the hierarchy is. And then it's a question of observation. So, look at what people are doing. How are they interacting with each other? What do they like to do in their spare time? Because that all combines to be the person that you see at work. In the US, quite seriously, understanding football and baseball and basketball makes a difference to your ability to engage with people. And there's a certain element of kind of national stereotype, but I think you've kind of got to take a pinch of national stereotype as your starting point.
So it sounds like the strategies you're talking about are cognitive strategies at first, right? To learn, to seek, to understand, either by research, trying to figure out what's the role of hierarchy, and by observation. And so that seems like a really wonderful best practice that we can extract from learning how to navigate cross-cultural environments.
Another point I would make is, what are your differences to this culture? So again, you've kind of got to understand your own culture to be able to understand somebody else's. Because if you understand what your sort of tics and preferences and do I fit my own national stereotype? Because people are going to be looking at you and thinking, that's an American, that's a Brit, that's a Russian. And do you want to say, example for me, I love my tea. Tea is often the answer in the UK to any problem. And I'm happy to kind of play that stereotype. But maybe I'm somebody who doesn't want to be a British person who's super keen on the royal family. Maybe you do. So make some of those choices and look at yourself while you're looking at others.
That is a really wonderful insight. I'd love to learn more from you about what actually does that look like for you, that investigation or that reflection about like, how is my culture impacting how I behave? Because we know from experience that some people can do that fairly easily. Other people are like, my culture doesn't impact me, and are less aware of the water they're swimming in. So I'm wondering how you think about that.
I think on the most basic level, it's what do people like about my culture? That helps you find some of the traits, and you might call it soft power. And also have a think about when people are derogatory maybe about your culture. How do you feel about that?
What stings, right? What resonates?
Stings. And is it because it's their right to criticize, or actually can you correct somebody and say, let me explain to you about my culture? So I think even though you think that you're just an average person and you don't abide by any of the stereotypes, I think you might surprise yourself when you start thinking about the good and bad that is the perception of where you come from. And one other thing I'd say is that culture only goes so far. So you shouldn't be saying, I'm either alike somebody or I'm very different to somebody because we've got different cultures, because you might find you've got other things in common that surpass or override the cultural differences. So it might be gender, it might be a disability that you share, it might be a passion for some random stamp collecting. So I think just because you're in a cross-cultural environment, don't automatically think this makes me different, because I think you might find areas of commonality that you didn't expect.
So we can acknowledge that there are differences, and we also want to acknowledge and celebrate what we share in common.
Yes.